Okay, everyone, welcome back. Just a reminder, I think the test is still on schedule for Monday, Chapter 8. Same uh, criteria I've had before. It's open for 24 hours. Please pay attention and get that taken care of. And hopefully we will have time on Friday to wrap this chapter up and review, but we'll see how we're doing. All right, so I was talking about a secure attachment, and the second part of that PowerPoint, it has this long sentence or paragraph that says, well, how would you know secure attachment if you saw it? And basically what Bowlby and Ainsworth say is that, well, that the child feels safe to explore their environment or their world, wherever they're at, knowing or sensing somehow this little child just kind of senses that their parent is looking out for their well-being. They're looking out for them, make sure they're safe, and that in the case of a traumatic experience, something frightening would occur, that the parent provides a safe emotional base for them to return. So, number one, what does it mean that they explore their world? That's what kids do. They wander around, they snoop into stuff. It's a big world. And somehow Bowlby and Ainsworth says if there is a secure bond there, that they kind of know that the parent is looking out for them. And if they were to venture into something they shouldn't, that the parent will probably go over and intervene and turn them away from that activity and direct them to something more safe. So that's kind of an instinctual thing. But the second half of this thing talks about this safe emotional base to return to. What they're talking about here is that if something were to happen that frightened the child, startled the child, that the parent would pick the child up, for instance, reassure them that everything's okay, they don't need to be frightened. Maybe lightning and thunder happens, a big storm, and the parent might comfort the child during that time. And that would be a sign of secure attachment rather than just ignoring them and letting them be frightened in that circumstance. So I think that makes sense. But just know that the secure attachment is a good thing. This will help parents deal with their teenagers someday, knowing that that relationship is strong to get through some of the conflicts we've mentioned in the last section. Well, that's pretty straightforward. The problem is then Bowlby and Ainsworth go into a discussion of insecure attachment, and in this section it's not so simple because there's different types of insecure attachment, and then within the insecure attachment there's different dynamics going on in the three different types. So now it's going to be a little more complex. So I've listed them here for you: dismissing avoidant, preoccupied ambivalent, and unresolved disorganized. So before I go any further, I want you to make some notes to yourself here using their PowerPoint if you or have it out. And let's look at dismissing avoidant. When we're talking about dismissing avoidant, both the parent and the kid, the adolescent, is engaged in dismissing behavior. I'll explain this in detail in just a second. And the parent and the kid are both engaged in avoidant behavior. So the parent and the kid doing dismissing, and the parent and the kid doing avoidant. Just keep that in mind. So just use some little symbol, adolescent A/parent, over both of those. When you go to preoccupied ambivalent, under the preoccupied, you're looking for a scenario in which the kid, the adolescent, is the one that's doing the preoccupied behavior, and the parent is the one doing the ambivalent behavior. So now you have the kid is preoccupied, the parent is ambivalent, and we'll come back to that one. And then finally, the unresolved disorganized form of insecure attachment is all about what happened to the kid and what the kid is doing. And so the scenario will be both the kid has an unresolved issue and they have some disorganized thoughts about that. So let's go back at the beginning, dismissing, avoiding. What they're talking about is when you talk to both parent and kid about restoring the relationship, they're going to both say they don't want to invest the time or the energy in the relationship. It's not worth salvaging. They pretty much dismiss the value or importance of trying to rebuild a relationship. So the parent's waiting for the kid to turn 18 to move out, and the kid can't wait till they're 18 to move out. So they're dismissing what a healthy family relationship would want to be about. And they're just not going to spend the time or the energy, and that's both parent and kid. Well, the same way with the avoidant. Because of that, what they're going to do is avoid each other's presence as much as possible, because usually it just ends up with fighting, or they don't get along, they don't have much to talk about. So the scenario there would be the kid comes home, mom or dad's in the kitchen, the kid's just going to go to the room, close the door, and get on their computer, and they would never talk all day. And that's fine with the parent, because maybe they argue anyway. Or the kid's in the living room watching TV, the parent comes home, they may go busy themselves outdoors or in their room and do something other than sit around and engage each other. So they avoid each other. Here's the key, it's mutual, okay? So they mutually avoid and dismiss the importance of restoring this relationship. Now, under preoccupied ambivalent, the second type of insecure attachment, the preoccupied means that the kid is what we call hyper-tuned. They're spending a lot of time thinking about how can they have more time with their parents. So this is kind of an opposite thing. They start off well-intended. They want more time with the parent. The problem with it is, in this case, the insecure attachment, is you have a parent, in this case, who is ambivalent. Ambivalent means somewhat non-caring. They could be neglectful. Go back to Baumrine's neglectful style of parenting. The parent, in other words, is going to kind of not be that motivated to spend time. So they're going to make excuses. So the scenario or example here that you might see on a test is a family in which there's been a separation or divorce, and the parents are living apart. And let's say the son, let's use son, wants to spend time with dad, and dad's supposed to have visitation on the weekends. In this particular type of insecure attachment, the son's going to be the one to initiate the call to dad and talk about coming over this weekend and seeing dad, and they can spend some time together. Dad's response will be, yeah, probably, check with me later in the week. The kid checks later in the week. The dad crawfishes a little bit more. Well, I'm not sure. I'll try, but I may have to work. And then finally, the kid calls on the Friday, I'm coming over, right? And then the dad backs out completely. No, I'm on call, and I might have to leave and go to work, so no, not this weekend. So the dad is somewhat ambivalent. And of course, what this does then, while it starts off with well-intentioned of spending time together, it leads to frustration and then eventual anger and conflict between the two. So again, that's called preoccupied ambivalent. And the third style, with the unresolved disorganized, the simplest way to remember this is there's been a traumatic experience. Some sort of trauma probably occurred, could have happened very early in life, where the young person has experienced a trauma within the family, and it never got resolved. So they call that unresolved. So if they've been abused or severely neglected, and they never got help for it, they never worked through it, and they carry that with them with each developmental stage, maybe even to early adulthood. They still have unresolved issues regarding that parent, let's say. Let's use abuse. And it's never been dealt with. Then what this causes is a thing called cognitive dissonance, or disorganized thought, in which the young person now really doesn't know how to even approach it, how to even discuss it, or whether to discuss it at all. So if they were to get together for a family Thanksgiving annual dinner, the very person that they had this trauma with may be there. Could be an uncle, could be dad, could be mom, and they don't know whether to ignore them totally or be rude to them or just pretend like everything's great. So there's a lot of cognitive dissonance or disorganization in dealing with that. Okay? And so that is the three different types of insecure attachment, and those are listed for you on page 269. I'm turning to page 270 and I see attachment in emerging adults. I don't have a PowerPoint for it, but basically, let me just summarize it for you real quickly and we'll move on. Bowlby and Ainsworth mostly discuss infancy, forming this bond throughout the childhood years, and how that would turn out for young adolescents and even emerging adults. And so the question is, well, how important it is for these young people as they are adolescents? Do they still need this secure attachment? Is that still a good thing? And of course the answer is absolutely. Young people do want more autonomy, more independence, but they also want to know that their parents are there to provide that safe emotional base for them to return during times of distress or something, a crisis situation. The difference now, instead of a thunder scaring them, maybe they're out and about with their friends and they get in a car accident. Of course, they want to know they can call the parents for help. The parents, of course, if there's this bond, this secure attachment, will be there for them to make sure they're okay and to get there and provide some sort of help and work through this crisis. I'm kind of fast forwarding over the next couple of pages, and so don't worry about that material because it is a quite big chapter and we are closing in on test 3 here. So I'm fast forwarding now to page 276, sibling relationships and the sibling roles. And so up till now, we've spent a great deal of time talking about the parents and the kids. We haven't spent a lot of time talking about, well, what about siblings? And so this discussion gets into the original comment I made about family systems approach, and that it's a complex social network of mutually influencing relationships. And again, we've mostly focused on the relationship between the parent and the kids. But as you have siblings, then that can also impact that family system, because kids arguing with each other could indirectly affect the parents' mood and relationship. So anyway, let's just talk about some of the just straightforward information here on sibling roles. It starts off by talking about around 80% of kids have at least one sibling. So that's the majority of our families in America. Most families have 2 or more kids. Very few people have just one child. We'll get to that in a minute. So what are the advantages and disadvantages to having a sibling? And so sometimes it's a catch-22 here. The advantages are also the disadvantages. For instance, if you have a sibling close to your own age, you have a playmate. Well, that's a good thing because you have someone to play with and help keep you occupied, because mom or dad may be busy with other things and they don't have time to sit and play with you. Well, that's wonderful, except for the problem is if you have a playmate, children, they have a high frequency of conflict with each other because they have a tendency to fight and argue about petty little things. So that's the downside of that. You have someone to share things with, like toys and play with, but the downside is, as soon as you figure out that sharing is good until there's a limited resource of cookies in the cookie jar, now you're not willing to share the last cookie, and that could be a problem. As kids get older, and I put a star by this one of the most important features of having a sibling as they move into adolescence is emotional support. Having someone to turn to and talk to, maybe even before they would talk to a parent. So maybe they're dating and then they break up with their boyfriend or girlfriend. They might talk to their sibling before they would talk to their parents about that and get advice from them. They might also look to their older sibling for socialization advice about making a transition into high school and how should they behave and how to get along at the high school level and so on. And then lastly, again, it could be positive or negative. Siblings have influence on each other, and that can be good or bad. So if you have an older sibling who is a positive role model, engaged in doing well in school or in sports and good attitude, and the younger one aspires to be like their older brother or sister, that'd be a good thing. But unfortunately, you could also have an older sibling who is engaged in maladaptive behavior, harmful behavior, drugs and so on, and the younger sibling may be tagging along and getting into the same things, and that would obviously be a problem. At the bottom of that PowerPoint, put a star by that. I see where I've written higher degree of conflict with siblings than underline it, than anyone else. So now we're switching from parent-adolescent conflict, where I told you that if you were asked who are kids going to report that they have most conflict with, it's going to be their mom, because they're around mom a lot. But when it comes to siblings, kids have more arguments, children have more arguments with their childhood siblings. Remember now, we're making a distinction here between a developmental stage. So I'm talking about in their childhood, not adolescence. So in childhood, they have more arguments or conflict with their sibling than anybody else on the planet. As they move into adolescence, their frequency of conflict with their sibling decreases. And again, the answer is because of less time spent together. As kids get older, they develop their own circle of friends, social activities that are different than their siblings, and they're going in different directions, and they're not around each other as much. And so they have less opportunity to have disagreements, and so the number of conflicts decreases, the frequency. Now that doesn't mean that the intensity might not go up. While they may have fewer little petty things, they may have more serious conflicts about an item of clothing that was borrowed and then destroyed or lost, or a cell phone used and dropped and broken, something like that, a much more intense type of conflict. So just keep that in mind. Birth order, got ahead of myself on that page. I see it's on page 277. What I want to say here, let's reverse these two PowerPoints. The one at the bottom is the one I want to say, talk about first. And it says, generally speaking, birth order is not, capital N-O-T, pay attention to that, is not a good predictor of adolescent behavior. Simply to take one factor like birth order, firstborn, secondborn, middle kid, whatever you want to call it, just that one factor is not nearly enough information to predict how a kid's going to behave or turn out later on as an adolescent or an emerging adult. And that's because of our approach now, with what I told you in the first page, is the social systems approach. In other words, we're looking at the whole family and a lot of factors. So it could be how many siblings are there? What are the age differences? What are the temperaments of the kids within the family? What's the socioeconomic status? What are the parenting styles? There's so many things that you would have to look at and factor in before you could make a prediction, and even then it would be somewhat difficult. So just remember that birth order in and of itself is not a good predictor. Having said that, now I go back to the other screen and say, well, let's talk about birth order. But really the most important one that the author addresses is firstborns, because that is a little more straightforward and you don't have the complexity of having to figure out the dynamics of other siblings. So a firstborn, generally speaking, and by the way, there's also a discussion about only child. So make a note to yourself, if you have two different test questions, one about a firstborn and another test question about an only child, the answer is the same. So what applies to one applies to the other, because an only child obviously is a firstborn. And a firstborn for some period of time is an only child for some period of time, unless there is going to be a second or a third. So what's going on? With the firstborn, obviously, you're going to have parents who are going to try to get it right. This is their first child. And so they have high expectations and maybe unrealistic on themselves and their child. And so this can create some problems for them and some stress. So they, with these higher expectations, they may put more pressure on this young person to excel, to do well. And so firstborns generally, and I would put a star by it, are very achievement oriented. They really, more often than not, they go on to college, they excel academically, they run companies, they start their own businesses, they're independent. And it's generally because, as a firstborn, these high expectations that parents place on these kids and on themselves to achieve. The problem, though, with a firstborn is that while there are no other siblings around for them to play with and some of the things I talked to you about, they look to their parents for to companionship, to play with them, spend time with them. So they're very adult oriented, but that doesn't give them much opportunity to be around other kids. So as they approach going to school, you might look at a scenario that it's Susie's first day of school. And while on the one hand she's excited about it and she's looking forward to getting to school and achieving and doing well and bringing home smiley faces for mom and dad to see and how proud they will be, she's also probably experiencing some anxiety as to maybe she won't live up to their expectations. Then you're going to pick an only child, or a firstborn, I'm sorry. Well, an only child, what I would pay attention to on this screen is that an only child is a firstborn. And there's this myth that if you're an only child, certainly you must be spoiled because you're the only child in the family. The truth of the matter is, an only child, the determination as far as being spoiled or not is not so much about being an only child, but it's much more related to the parenting style. So if it were me and I had to answer a question is what is a better predictor of a young person being spoiled, it would be parenting style, and the parenting style you should pick would be permissive indulgent, where the parents spoil the kids rather than the fact that they're just an only child. Because an only child might be being raised in a neglectful home. They may be being abused. They could be in a home in which the parents are authoritarian style. And they're certainly not going to feel spoiled in that home. So the better predictor would be the style of the parent, the parenting style, and that particular style would be the indulgent style. Again, I'm going to stop here. I'm going to, when we, Friday, I'm going to record another session for you, beginning with section 4, if you're keeping up in the book and reading ahead, and it's the changing family and changing society. This is probably going to be the biggest section and the most test questions because it gets into the whole issue of divorce, single parenting, remarriage, step families, and step kids. So there's a lot of information in this section. So we'll cover that on Friday and hopefully prepare you for the test coming up on Monday.